A lot of the young right wing guys are super hardcore and they go around bashing women, gays, and baby boomers. And basically, I don't think we have the luxury of doing that. At some point, we're going to have to turn this thing into a mass movement. And it's going to require that all three of the groups that I just mentioned be allowed to come in and take part. Now, you don't have to allow everybody in. All the groups that I just mentioned have a wide diversity of talents, of viewpoints, of abilities, and all that kind of stuff. But whenever you start bashing large groups of people, not on the basis of their individual characteristics, but over the entire group, that's called prejudice. And it's not a good idea to be prejudiced. Groups do have important characteristics, right? We understand that. And I don't want to be like a super rampant individualist. But you can't just go bashing the entire group like that, especially when it cuts across your other core constituencies. Like even some of the white nationalists out there will go around, bashing women and baby boomers. And it's like, guys, how do you think that you're going to be able to organize people on the basis of white identity if you're cutting out a huge part of the age group and 50% of the population based on sex? So it just doesn't make sense to me. One of the critiques I'm going to talk about baby boomers specifically as an example. Baby boomers were people who were born, let's say, between 1945 and 1965. And one of the charges, the main charge that's leveled against them, is that they were on watch when the country really went downhill, basically from the 1960s onward. And we could use the examples of the Civil Rights Act in 64, the Voting Rights Act in 65, and the Civil Rights Act in 68. Not that everything about those things was bad, but that's when the left began to define our current political agenda. And states' rights became less important. The federal government became more important. Pardon me. And the courts began to decide on the basis of your membership in a victim group, such as race, religion, sexuality, all that kind of stuff, what the society would be able to accept and not accept. No longer would it be defined by the Constitution or the representatives, but more by the court system and the radical leftist activists. So, also the immigration, the Hart-Celler Act, which got rid of the quotas on the non-white immigration and opened it up to people from all over the world. So all that stuff happened in the mid to late 60s. And the argument goes that the baby boomers were the ones who were in charge and that they let all this happen. Now, I looked at some demographic data, and for people who were born between 1945 and 1965, only about 18 to 20% of the white electorate, not even the whole electorate, but just the white electorate, were from that generation, from the baby boomer generation in 1970, let's say. Only about 1 in 5. If you look at the presidential election in 1968, they had Nixon for the Republicans, they had Humphrey for the Democrats, and George Wallace ran his third party campaign. If you look at the results those three candidates got, it's split amongst all three candidates, basically across the whole country. The votes spread across all three candidates pretty widely, more widely than I thought before I looked at it. So it's kind of hard for me to say that this 1 out of 5 group of people, the baby boomers in 1970, for example, were the extreme prime mover in the American political agenda in 1970. It's just not the case. So since the American public never really got a vote on civil rights and they didn't get a vote on the Hart-Celler Immigration Act, I think we have to say that all that stuff was basically done by political elites rather than by the public. So I think we have to let the baby boomers off the hook for that one. What they could have done and what everybody else could have done is raise a fuss and had it all redone by the Congress later. But they didn't. Okay. In 1990, fast forward 30 years, 20 years, fast forward 20 years. In 1990, the baby boomers had basically reached their peak of demographic representation in the country. The baby boomers were about 40% of the white electorate. And what happened around 1990 was NAFTA. The United States faced another big change in which our manufacturing base began to be shipped overseas while our purchasing power increased as we got cheap goods from places like China and everywhere else. It had long-term consequences, but at the time, people didn't really understand or see what was going on. They were promised endless riches, right? Didn't work out. But they were 40% of the white electorate, so I think probably going to have to say that the baby boomers are responsible for that. They were reaching prominence in the late Reagan, probably the second Reagan, first Bush Sr., Clinton, and probably the first term of George W. Bush, the second Bush. So now the baby boomers have basically declined today, or at least that we'll say as of 2010, they've declined to about 34%. So the representation is going down even amongst the white electorate. They're being replaced by the Generation X people, by the millennials, by Generation Z very slightly, and even some of the older people are still around. People who are older than the baby boomers are still around and voting. So for me, taking it all together, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me to blame the baby boomers for everything. And I understand sometimes people get frustrated, and you're looking at the people on Twitter that you're fighting against, or people online you're fighting against. They all look like they're from a certain white demographic, and you just want to go after them completely. But we just can't afford to do it. We just absolutely cannot afford to do it. There's so many of those people out there who actually share our views, or they share enough of them to where they're politically useful and they're good allies. And they've got like a subconscious understanding about what's really going on, even if they can't articulate it, and even if they're never going to come over to be, thinkers and thought leaders and things like that, even though those people are out there in that group. All you've got to do is meet about 10 or 20 of them, I guess, who you agree with and who you can have good conversations with before you realize that damning the entire demographic group of people is just not a good strategy. I'm trying to think in the long term. I don't really care if my videos get 10 views or 100 views. I want to put good information out there, so that's why I'm advocating this. It's what I really believe. So long story short, at some point we've got to make this into a big tent movement, and we don't want to throw good people out of it. We need the good people to be in here with us in the tent so that we can win. Thank you for your time.